There's a secret crisis hiding behind one of the world's best airports that could see its entire monopoly shatter overnight with just 2 phone calls. Singapore Changi has won top global airport awards more than any other hub on the planet. It processes tens of millions of passengers a year. Airlines fight for slots. Travelers rave about the butterfly garden and the indoor waterfall. But there is a physics problem that no amount of architecture can solve. We know how good Changi is. What almost nobody talks about is why it could all collapse with a single phone call from Kuala Lumpur or Jakarta. Singapore is a city-state. Its total land area is just over 730 square kilometers. From east to west, the island stretches barely 50 kilometers. Now consider what it takes to land a modern jetliner. An Airbus A350 or a Boeing 777 requires roughly 100 to 150 miles of gradual descent from cruising altitude to touchdown. That distance is physically larger than the entire country of Singapore, which means every single commercial aircraft arriving at or departing from Changi must spend significant time flying through the sovereign airspace of Malaysia to the north or Indonesia to the south. The operational survival of the world's most celebrated airport depends entirely on its neighbors continuing to say yes. And the story of how Singapore locked in that permission in the first place starts with a loophole from 1946 that was never supposed to last this long. After World War II, international aviation authorities carved up the global skies into blocks called Flight Information Regions. These FIRs determined which country would manage air traffic control in a given area. Singapore, still under British colonial rule at the time, had something its neighbors did not: superior radar, better communications equipment, and a functioning aviation infrastructure left behind by the Royal Air Force, so the authorities handed Singapore management of a massive block of regional airspace, not just the sky above the island, but the airspace stretching over Indonesia's Riau Islands, the Natuna Islands, and the southern portion of the Malaysian peninsula. For decades, Singapore wasn't just directing planes in its own sky. It was controlling all commercial traffic over its neighbors' sovereign territories, collecting route charges, and optimizing every single flight path to funnel aircraft directly into Changi. Singapore operated as if it had the airspace of a nation 50 times its size. Airlines built connecting schedules around it. Billions of dollars in trade flowed through it. The entire hub model that made Changi famous was constructed on top of a colonial-era administrative arrangement that its neighbors never fully accepted. And in 2018, one of those neighbors decided to prove exactly how fragile the whole system really was. Singapore published new instrument landing procedures for Seletar, its secondary airport on the northern edge of the island. The approach path required aircraft to descend directly over Pasir Gudang, a heavily industrialized zone in southern Malaysia packed with factories, port cranes, and petrochemical facilities. Malaysia objected immediately. The new flight path would impose height restrictions on Malaysian buildings and infrastructure, essentially allowing Singapore's aviation needs to dictate what Malaysia could build on its own soil. The response was swift and devastating. Malaysia declared a restricted military zone directly over Pasir Gudang. Overnight, the airspace Singapore needed for its new landing system became a no-fly zone. Singapore had no choice. It suspended the instrument landing procedures at Seletar and rerouted affected flights. The dispute dragged on for months before a diplomatic resolution was reached, but the damage was done. Malaysia had demonstrated something the aviation world had politely ignored for decades. It could legally choke Singapore's flight paths at any time, for any reason, and there was nothing Changi could do about it except ask nicely. The crisis was resolved, the vulnerability was not. But here is what made the Seletar incident truly alarming. It wasn't an act of aggression, it was an act of sovereignty. Malaysia exercised a right that any nation possesses over its own airspace. And that meant the real question was never whether a neighbor could disrupt Changi. It was when and why the next disruption would come. The answer was already forming 700 kilometers to the south. While Malaysia squeezed from the north, Indonesia had been building toward a far larger reckoning for over 30 years. Indonesian politicians and military officials had viewed Singapore's control of the airspace above the Riau Islands as a profound insult to national sovereignty. The absurdity was hard to overstate. Indonesian military jets flying between two Indonesian islands sometimes had to request clearance from Singaporean air traffic controllers just to transit their own country's sky. Under President Joko Widodo, reclaiming this airspace became a matter of intense national pride. Negotiations stretched for years, tense and deeply political. Then, in March 2024, a historic treaty was finally ratified. Indonesia legally took back control of the airspace above the Riau and Natuna Islands. The airspace that Singapore had managed since 1946 was no longer Singapore's to manage, but dismantling the arrangement overnight would have caused catastrophic disruption to Changi's operations and to hundreds of international flights daily. So a complex compromise was engineered. Indonesia delegated the airspace closest to Singapore, from the ground up to 37,000 feet, right back to Singapore to manage operationally. The delegation lasts 25 years. Singapore must now remit collected route charges to Indonesia as a lease payment for the privilege of managing air traffic it once controlled outright. The dynamic had fundamentally and permanently shifted. Singapore was no longer the owner of this airspace, it was the tenant, and tenants can be evicted. This arrangement created a ticking clock that almost nobody outside the aviation industry is paying attention to. Because while Singapore negotiates lease terms and manages diplomatic sensitivities, it is simultaneously making the single largest infrastructure bet in its history. Singapore is building Terminal 5. This is not a new wing or an expansion gate. This is essentially a second Changi airport being constructed adjacent to the original. Terminal 5 is designed to add 50 million passengers to Changi's annual capacity. That requires thousands of additional weekly flights. More flights mean tighter spacing between arriving aircraft, which means absolute unhindered control of descent corridors stretching hundreds of miles into Malaysia and Indonesia. Every additional flight amplifies the dependency. Every tightened arrival sequence demands more precision across airspace Singapore does not own. The project carries a price tag in the tens of billions of dollars, and here is where the math becomes terrifying. Singapore is spending this money on the assumption that Malaysia and Indonesia will continue to permit their airspace to function as Changi's personal driveway for decades to come, but both neighbors are building their own aviation ambitions. Malaysia is expanding Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Indonesia is modernizing Jakarta's Soekarno-Hatta. Both nations have every economic incentive to prioritize their own hubs. Restricting airspace access to Singapore, even subtly through increased military exercise schedules or administrative delays, could degrade Changi's efficiency enough to redirect traffic toward their own growing airports. A 5-minute delay per arrival, multiplied across thousands of weekly flights, costs airlines millions in fuel and destroys the tight connecting schedules that make Changi a global hub. This is not hypothetical. It is already happening on a small scale. When Indonesia or Malaysia conduct routine military air exercises in their sovereign airspace, blocks of sky are temporarily closed to civilian traffic. For a normal country, air traffic controllers simply reroute commercial flights over a different part of their own territory. Singapore cannot do this. There is no domestic sky to absorb the overflow. Incoming flights from Europe, the Middle East and Australia must enter holding patterns, burn extra fuel or accept significant delays. Each exercise creates a temporary ceiling on how efficiently Changi can operate. And these exercises are sovereign rights that no treaty or negotiation can eliminate. Singapore has no leverage to prevent them and no alternative airspace to use when they happen. The 25-year delegation agreement with Indonesia includes provisions for coordination, but coordination is not the same as control. If Indonesia increases military activity over the Riau Islands, or if Malaysia expands restricted zones near the Johor Strait, Changi's capacity degrades automatically. Now multiply this by the demands of Terminal 5. 50 million additional passengers require a system operating at peak efficiency every single day. One neighbor's military exercise on a busy Friday afternoon could cascade into hours of delays affecting tens of thousands of travelers and dozens of connecting flights. The entire Terminal 5 business case assumes a level of geopolitical cooperation that has never been guaranteed and has already been disrupted twice in the last 6 years. Terminal 5 is scheduled to open in phases through the 2030s. By that time, Singapore's 25-year airspace lease with Indonesia will be approaching its midpoint. Malaysia's own aviation expansion plans will be well underway, and a new generation of leaders in Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, leaders with no memory of the post-colonial arrangements that gave Singapore its airspace advantage, will be making decisions about how their sovereign skies are used. Singapore has built the most beautiful, most efficient, most awarded airport terminal complex on Earth. It has trained the best air traffic controllers. It has attracted the world's top airlines. But none of that changes the physics. A commercial jet needs more sky to land than Singapore has country. Changi's future does not depend on how many awards it wins or how many waterfalls it builds inside its terminals. It depends on whether two neighboring governments with their own airports to fill and their own national pride to protect will keep lending Singapore the sky it cannot survive without. The Seletar crisis lasted months. The Indonesian airspace renegotiation took decades. Terminal 5 is a bet measured in generations, and no one can say with certainty what happens when the lease runs out. If this story surprised you, click here for another one.